Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming and welcome to this Mammal Society free webinar on the National Harvest Mouse Survey. There's just a few things I'd like to mention before we start. Every month, the Mammal Society hosts free webinars like this, and if you'd like to stay informed about things like this and the work that the Mammal Society does, feel free to sign up to our newsletter and follow our social media channels. So my name's Ross, and I'm the Data and Research Officer at the Mammal Society. And this evening, I'm delighted to be joined by Derek Crawley, who is, among other things, the Vice Chair of the Mammal Society's Council, Chairman of the Staffordshire Mammal Group, and the Regional Harvest Mouse Coordinator for Staffordshire. Throughout this presentation, please feel free to share your thoughts and reflections in the chat. It'd be great to know where you're dialing in from, and if you have any feedback on the time and format of this webinar, we'd really appreciate hearing about it. And if you have any questions for Derek, please post them in the Q&A, and we'll cover them at the end of the session. So just to start with, for those who don't know us, the Mammal Society was established in 1954 and is dedicated to the monitoring, study and conservation of mammals across the British Isles. Our vision is a future in which sustainable mammal populations thrive as part of a healthy and diverse ecosystems, benefiting people and nature across the British Isles. And our mission is threefold. We work to ensure a bright future for mammals in the British Isles by inspiring, informing, supporting and enhancing conservation projects and policies that protect and restore native mammal populations and their habitats. We empower conservationists, students, citizen scientists, and nature champions to play a key role in mammal conservation now and in the future through providing training, resources, and survey activations. And we seek to build public awareness of and support for mammal conservation through education, communications, and campaigns. So thank you for coming. I won't keep you any longer. I'll pass over to Derek. Here you go. Off you go, Derek.
Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, my name's Derek. I'm the Vice Chair of the Mammal Society. I've been involved in the setting up and the running of the Harvest Mouse surveys for the last 2 years. And before that, I've been discovering harvest mice for about the last 20 years in Staffordshire. And it's the usual issue that we all had, is that we thought we ought to have harvest mice, but there were no records. So we had about a 60-year period within Staffordshire of no records of harvest mice whatsoever. So you would have thought that they would be extinct. But then we had an incidental record came in, and a case of was this or was this not a harvest mouse. We decided the nest was a harvest mouse, and therefore we decided we needed to know more about how to find them. So we went on a training course, and that's what was the easiest thing to do. And from finding on that training course of going out with some other surveyors who currently looked at harvest mice, we learned how to do it. We came back to Staffordshire, and within half an hour of our first survey on a national nature reserve, hey presto, we had harvest mice. And we've gone on to basically find them across the county, and every autumn-winter programme, we have people going out finding harvest mice nests. It's become a little bit of a competition. What we wanted to do tonight was encourage you to go out and do your own surveys, and at the same time to try and actually tie in with other groups. Although you can do it on your own, it's much more fun when there's a few more people to go with it. So one of the first things that you need to be aware of is that there is a dedicated page within our website that's all about the harvest mouse surveys. On there you will find last year's report from the first year that we ran it, and the second report from last year should, he says, be put onto that website in about the next 3 to 4 weeks. So you can have an understanding of what's gone on, where people have looked and everything else, and we'll share some of that with you. And Matt's just very kindly put that link up for us now. So before we go much further, let me just share my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, so this is the harvest mouse. There are a variety of different ways that you can actually record them. But the main way is to look at old nests that have been used. These tend to be breeding nests, which is why we don't start looking until October, when we hope that the breeding season's finished. And they are made up of intertwined leaves from living plants that are actually woven together to make a round nest. And that becomes quite important because the other animal that makes a very similar nest, which is the dormouse, actually has again a woven nest, but it's actually just supported in the vegetation rather than it being attached. And that's one of the easy ways of actually looking at it. So the problem that the poor old harvest mice has got is it's got to be able to hang on to one stem while it reaches across to another in order to grab the leaves and then to actually shred them between their front teeth to put them into two little bits so they can then weave them into a ball. So the difference between where those stalks are and where the vegetation actually crosses becomes very important when you start to look at what habitat is best. So if we start off with grassland, this is your fairly standard meadow, but it's all too short. It's all short vegetation. Although there are long stems within there, they're too far apart. And the stuff in the foreground is no good. It's great for field voles, but it's no good for harvest mice itself. As you go towards the back of the picture and you start to have higher plants within there where the stems are a little bit closer together, that's more the area that you're going to find harvest mice in. And it's just trying to work out where best to actually look in the first place, because you don't want to waste your time. And we don't want you to go out and not look in the right place. So again, if we move on to a different area, this is a marshland area, and you've got two types of grass here. You've still got the short grass, which is no point in looking at, and you can see the lady in the hat is actually looking for field voles, but the two gentlemen in the foreground are looking at these tussock grasses, where the actual taller vegetation of the tussock is where you're actually going to find the nest. The long stems of the seed heads helps you identify the plant. And I think Matt's going to put in a link to an online app that will help you identify plants if you're not very good at looking at plants. But this is actually Cotsfoot, and we tend to find that that's very good for harvest mice in the rough grassland areas where it hasn't been cut for a couple of years. And by actually going through the low clumps of grass, then that's where you're going to find the nest. And it's trying to look in the appropriate place in the appropriate vegetation to try and work things out. If you've got any grasses that will actually grow up through some form of supporting structure like bramble or even a fence, then it makes it that slightly bit easier. And you can see here that although the area has been recently mowed, they just left this little section along the hedge line here, and those tall grasses are ideal for harvest mice to actually hide into and actually create their nests. And actually in this little section here, I did find two nests not too far apart, which is probably from the same animal, but it shows presence. And that's what the survey is really all about, is trying to show presence within your survey itself. Again, in the old ditch here, you can see there's some reed canary grass. And again, you can see how closely together the leaves are and the stems, and that would be another good place to look. The short grass over to the right isn't worth looking at. Even though there are some clumps of soft rush, it doesn't have that leaf structure that the harvest mice actually need to make their living nest. Now, although this is quite late in the season and a lot of this vegetation has actually fallen down, this is again reed canary grass. And this little section here, we normally find about 6 or 7 nests, both in the standing vegetation, but also where it's actually fallen over. And by sifting through this, almost like using a comb and going through the individual stems, you can come across the small balls which are about the size of a tennis ball, with neatly woven material in them, but still actually attached to the stems. So when you try to pull it out, it's quite difficult to pull out because it's attached. And if you actually grab hold of the stems from below, then you can basically hold it up and the nest will just hang off the stems and the leaves. This is actually a sedge instead. Here you've got to be a little bit careful because sedges have got very sharp edges. And if you're not wearing gloves, then you're actually going to end up getting cut, etc. But again, you can see how closely together the actual leaves are here. And again, this is another good way of actually moving through this vegetation and finding harvest mice nests again. Sometimes they're not just on the main vegetation there, but as other grasses grow up through it, they'll actually use those and this as a supporting network to actually hold it. And even on the bank looking up towards the top of the path there, you can see it's still fairly rough grass, and that again, different method lower down to look, but it would still be a good habitat to look at. Even areas of set aside where the vegetation is slightly longer, so whether it be a birdseed mix that's actually gone on, or even down to elephant grass, then again there's enough structure within those and they're there long enough for the harvest mice to actually exploit them. And quite often, even in the arable fields, then the hedgerows and the fences alongside will have that rough grass, and therefore it's a good place to look. Reed bed generally is another good one, but again, it's trying to look at that gap between the stems. So here you've got that nice bit of reed bed, but you can see through it, and therefore you're not really going to find the opportunity for the mice to actually be able to reach across between the stems to actually make that nest. But where sometimes it falls together and the leaves are actually much more closely together, then that's where they're actually you would start to look for. So here is a nest, and this is the problem. It doesn't look like anything in particular. It's just all sort of mashed together in a nice ball. It's the same color as the vegetation around it, which makes it quite a difficult thing to actually find and say, well, yes, that's definitely a structure. It's still got green leaves amongst it, and it's still, you can actually see that a lot of the leaves have been shredded, and you can see that definitely on the left-hand side with those grasses coming out that's been almost divided into 3 or 4 sections. So having that shredded is a good sign of harvest mice, and sometimes you don't even need to have the nest that goes with it. It can just be these shreddings on the old vegetation that shows that that a harvest mice might have started to have a nest, and normally very close to that you'll then find the nest. So it almost has had a little bit of a try beforehand and then gone on to make the nest. So this is what we're talking about. So the animal, just before it's about to give birth, the female will grab hold of one stem, reach across, and then pull these leaves through her mouth to actually split them down. And it takes a little bit of time to actually then make this dome. And you can see it's about 6 to 10 centimeters in diameter, attached in the same color as the surrounding vegetation, which makes them very hard to actually find in the summer. But again, if we were doing that, we would be causing disturbance to the actual animals. So we wait until the autumn when hopefully they've stopped breeding, and we're just looking for those redundant breeding nests. Sometimes they can be quite dilapidated because if you've had 6 young that's grown up in there, they basically ruin the household. But you still get a woven structure which gives us that indication. This just shows you that gestation period, but what we want to do is just move on to look at the issue with nests and what they look like. So this one, as you can see, is how many youngsters can you get in a nest and still have a nest. So this is starting to look at actually nests that are there. You can see that if you do pull them out of the vegetation, they basically sit in your hand. They're not dissimilar size to that of a tennis ball. This one was taken from this rough field with the tussock grasses in it again. of both the coltsfoot, but also of some of the other tussock species, which I'm afraid I can't identify. And you can see this is a nice hot summer's day, and we even managed to find these nests well into the into sort of April, May. But generally, a lot of them have actually disappeared by that stage, battered by the weather. So they're not always as easy to find. It is a little bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And it's a case of going through the vegetation to try and just separate out those stalks, almost a layer at a time, until you find a nicely tight ball. So this is actually in some nice reed bed. You can see how the reeds have all fallen over. And just as we started to open it up to look through that, those layers of stuff, you can see the nest center picture, a little round ball that just looks slightly different. Still attached, so even if we pulled that out, it would still be attached, and that's the important aspect that goes with it. Here we have another one. This is in some sedges, but the actual nest itself is made up of smaller bits of grass that's still attached, but you can see the woven structure that goes with it, and you can see some of those little splits in the grass and the surrounding vegetation that indicates that this is going to be a harvest mouse nest. Now, within these vegetations, you can get other nests as well, but they tend not to be a ball. And if you put them in your hand and jiggled them around, the harvest mouse nests stay as a ball, whereas the other species start to basically fall apart because they haven't got a particular structure that goes with them. Again, looking across within this one, you can see these sit at about 1/2 to 3/4 the way up. You can just see it next to the greener leaves towards the bottom, and it's just in there. And again, it's still fairly wet areas, but you've still got this, I think it's this soft rush again, or not soft rush, it's going to be one of the rushes and one of the reeds that go with it. Again, this is one of the issues that we have, is trying to identify which species it's actually in, which will help other people to find it. If you get the idea of what the vegetation looks like, that's what's important at the moment. This is looking at the tussock grasses again, and just by opening up those tussock grasses, you can see the nest hidden in amongst the top of that tussock. Sometimes you find them a little bit lower, but it's still this typical ball that goes with it. And that's just a little bit closer look to see that it's just nestled in. Sometimes you do have to push your fingers well down into these tussocks to actually find out where that nest is. You will find the field vole nests within that area, but then they say they don't tend to come in these balls. They tend to come in just loose material, all heaped together in what might look like a dome, but it actually falls apart. You could be lucky enough and find a much smaller nest. This is about the size of a golf ball, and this is an individual nest. They make them both during the summer when they're high up in the stalks, but they also make them towards the winter when they're actually much more closer to the ground. And it's just a case of still, this is soft rush, and this is actually pulling this soft rush apart, and we managed to find this small nest that goes with it on this occasion. And it's not much bigger, as you can see there, than a 50p piece. And still we managed to get a mouse in there to keep themselves warm across the winter months. I know the picture's not brilliant, but sometimes it just can be that you've got some thin grasses in front of you, and you can just pull out a shape within it. And the shape on this one is sort of 3/4 the way up, slightly on the left-hand side. Or it might be that, again, as you're walking along a path and you're looking into that vegetation on the side, you can still then find these balls of nest materials that go with it. So that one again is about 2/3 of the way up the page, and it's just below the bramble, it's framed by the bramble. So this was just off a path, and it just walking past, and you just notice it once you get your eye in, and that's the important one that goes with it. And even if you go to some other areas, so if you're maybe up in Scotland or in the Highlands, then within the black grass on heather moors, we've even found harvest mice within those. So it's very much a case of if the vegetation is close enough together and has got a little bit of height within it, it's worth having a look, because you will find the nests eventually. And that's just a closer view of that one. It's not a perfect nest that goes with it, but it has got that structure. It was attached, and it has actually got woven sections within it. This is going back to that fence and a little bit of bramble. And here you can see on the left-hand side, you've got the two nests close together. Okay, again, about 3/4 of the way up the page, in line with the green leaves, and then slightly below it to go with it. It's not easy. And this is the thing we want to emphasize. It's all about the detail. You have to really shift through the grasses, and you're just trying to find something that's not going to give, that's got some sort of more form. It's a different shape than the rest of the grasses going together. Again, if we go across to more wetland areas and you've got sedges, etc., then you can actually still find these. The vegetation has fallen over a little bit, but as you go through the clumps, you should be able to see there's a nest just above the green glove, or just by the green glove. So it's just looking in that vegetation again that's very close together. And again, here's the sedges. And again, as you part these sedges, there's the nest just sitting quite nicely within that section. Okay, and as I say, the important part here is it is attached. So you can just about see my thumb at the bottom of the picture there. And all I'm doing is holding about 3 or 4 stems, and that nest is nicely just sat on it because it's actually connected. If I turned it upside down, it still wouldn't fall out, which is the important aspect within this. Not quite so well shredded, but that's partly down to these much tougher leaves of the sedges, but it still creates this little ball, which is what we're after. However, this doesn't look a little bit, well, it looks like it could be. It's a balled nest which is actually woven together, but because this one is supported within a piece of hawthorn, and it's a little bit bigger than we'd normally expect to find for a harvest mice, then this is actually a dormouse nest, and they're very difficult to tell them apart. And it's all about whether or not those grasses that they've been using, whether they're still attached to the main living stems of that grass species, or whether it's merely been put into some other structure to hold it in place. So this might be within bramble, it might be within things like meadowsweet, might be other structures where it's actually been put that will held up, or it could be, as the example here is within hawthorn. And again, this is another neat little nest. This one is actually inside of a dormouse tube, but again, it shows you within that one. We haven't as yet found out that harvest mice are using these artificial structures. They don't tend to go into boxes and make these nests because they tend to use the living material that goes with it. So on the whole, we haven't got round to using nest boxes to try and help them find harvest mice. They don't want to use it because they are actually using those living things. And even here, another nice little ball, nicely put together, but again independent. And this again is a winter nest for a dormouse, just found on the ground, but not attached again. So there are oddities that go with it, This one you can see isn't really a ball as such, it's more a pile of grasses, and this is what you'd normally expect to find of voles of some description. That's quite a large section, so it might well come down to a water vole, but sometimes depending on what's there and how high above the ground it is to get away from the wet, sometimes even field voles will make quite large piles to actually have some security at night. And this is a prime example of one of those. So it's almost a ball, but it's not woven. You can see it's just all little shortcut pieces together, piled up and mixed around a bit in trying to just make some shelter. As you can see, we have managed to find them in odd places. So here we have the elephant grass, where other vegetation was actually growing through it, and the nest went into that, all woven together and actually partly attached to the elephant grass. And the other one on the other side is looking at some of the sedges, still quite short sections, but still attached, which still makes it down to the harvest mice. And occasionally we do get these oddities. This is a very, very large nest that's just been sitting in that, but because it's within the raspberry canes here, we can't make our mind up whether or not, just from a photograph, whether this is harvest mouse or not. So that's the sort of the indication of what you need to consider when it goes out looking for nests and what some of those nests look like. What we really need to do is talk through of how you actually carry out a survey. Let me just, you don't need to see that. So in order to carry out the survey, it's a case of knowing where your start point is and then walking through that vegetation for I'm not going to say a set period, but for a distance. It needs to be at least, we would hope, half an hour of looking, or it could be a couple of hours of looking. Ideally, we'd like you to use the Mammal tracker app, which you can get on your phone. For those who haven't seen it, it basically looks like this. I don't know whether that will show up or not, but there's a link there that you can actually use. It's a free app, sits on your phone. In that, you can say you're undertaking a harvest mouse survey. It'll follow you wherever you go, even if it's round and round in circles, and quite often it is. And every time you come across a nest, you can then take a picture of it and you can record different aspects that it asks you. So it normally asks you for how high the vegetation is. It asks you to identify that vegetation and surrounding habitats. And it asks you to actually measure how high up the vegetation the actual nest is. Then all that information comes to us directly, but you could write all of that down on a piece of paper. Ideally, we also want to know how many people are in your group and how long you've been looking for. If it's on the app, then it all basically works that way. And as Matt's just said, when you start it, you can actually dedicate it to be a harvest mouse survey, but it doesn't stop you recording anything else that you find on the way. Again, this information is actually on that web page that we've given you, but if we basically look at that particular web page, we'll be able to get an interactive map, which I will get up for in a short while. And one of the things that we've managed to do from the previous surveys is to actually look at the different habitat classes where people have gone and work out how many maps, how many nests people have managed to find, how many surveys have been done, and whether or not those sites have been occupied. And one of the interesting things is that we've worked out something called the NPHSE, which basically shows you how long it takes for somebody to find a harvest mouse within a set period of time. So that becomes quite useful. So basically, once you started surveying, the average time is about 30 minutes.
There's a question here for you, Derek, while you're looking for the for your stuff.
Yep.
If you were looking for a location to carry out a survey, what criteria would you look for?
One that you have access to, so that you can actually get onto the land. So you have to ask permission to actually do it. And then an area which is of a suitable size, either linear or in a patch that will take you about half an hour to look at, of suitable vegetation. As far as the area goes, that's what I'm just trying to work out for you at the moment. So this is the interactive map, of which you will have access to via the web page. So does anyone want to go to a particular area? Because you can basically move the map around and then zoom in to look. So I can cheat and go to my own area, which is Staffordshire. And as I go in, you can see the larger squares and then the smaller squares of where we've actually looked. So I can go and look at this one, click on that, and it tells me what tetrad it is, what hectare it is, the county and everything else. And then if I actually look a little bit further, it tells me the on that particular one, it was no results, so it's an empty square. So you could go back and look at that again, or you could go to one of the squares next to it instead. Let's go up here at Stoke. Okay, and there we've got presence both in 2001 and 2002. So if we wanted to see whether that site was still viable for harvest mice, we can go back this year and survey it again to show that they've actually got the population is sustainable in that area. Or it could be that we look at another area next to it and actually say, well, actually, are they going to be the other side of Stoke? Are they going to be, is there some sort of connectivity, or is that an isolated population? Or it could be that we might decide that actually we haven't seen anything around Tunstall, so maybe we ought to go to Tunstall and find an area and start looking. And that could be absolutely anything. It could be the an edge of a public footpath. It could be next to the pavement on a road, and you've got a little bit of hedgerow that's got suitable vegetation in it. It could be the set aside area on a farm, or just the section next to the hedge on a farm that you're allowed to walk down and just have a look to see if you can't find a nest that's there. And you could be fairly systematic and go across your area, or if you wanted to make a little bit more of it, and where we're hoping to find more people is to maybe find some of these people that haven't got any records in those area, and maybe look around Sleaford or Spalding where we haven't got any records. In particular, if I bring the map all the way down, you can see that most of Wales haven't got any recent records, and again, a lot of Scotland haven't got many records. So those are two areas that we want to look. We know from an awful lot of the mammal books, they state that there are no harvest mice in Scotland, and yet we found them both in 2000, 2001, 2002. So we know that they are present, but again, we haven't done full surveys simply because people don't think they're there. So it's trying to re-educate people as far as that goes. So are there any more questions?
Yeah, a couple of questions have come through, Derek. First question, is there a risk of disturbing the mice when surveying for them, and how can this be avoided?
There's a low chance. It all depends. If you find a nest that is still green, then it's the assumption is that it's still It's just been made, and there might be a female in there that's either about to give birth or is going to be with young. But the reason that we do the surveys this late in the year should mean that those nests are no longer occupied, and therefore there is no disturbance as such within it. So a lot of people actually collect the nests that they find because it is like a little mini trophy, and you won't cause any problems within that. The female has up to 3 or 4 litters a year, and there's a new nest for each one. So you might find one that was from beginning of the season, or you might find one towards the end. You can sometimes set out live traps for harvest mice, but most of the time at this time of year, we tend to find them and catch them at ground level rather than high up in vegetation. In the summer, we tend to catch them a little bit more in high up in vegetation, but it's not a very common animal to actually catch, but it is possible.
Thank you very much. I'll let you carry on unless you're would you like to move on to questions now, Derek?
I'm happy to move on to questions. I'm happy to, if people have got something that we can actually show them visually, then that would probably be, I'll do that as time goes on. But if we've got more questions, then let's go with those.
So actually a follow-up question from Miranda, who was asking about the criteria of a survey site earlier on. Excuse me. Should they look for someone that has long grass at the field margins and a water source nearby?
The water source, it's quite a fun one, actually. I've just come back from a conference in Switzerland on harvest mice, and there, all their sightings of harvest mice are associated with water. And in fact, they want to call the harvest mouse a sedge mouse rather than the harvest mouse, because they find them always in sedges. And what happens, so there is an association with water, but because we find them on rough grassland areas, farmers' fields away from water, definitely in England and within Scotland and also Wales, they're not restricted to water environments. They will be on much drier grass areas, but they tend to show themselves more depending where the vegetation is and what's there. So sometimes the taller vegetations tend to be associated with wetlands, whereas the rough grass areas aren't.
Super. Thanks very much. Another question from Jenny. Does a female make a new nest for each litter?
Yeah, they do. So basically, she gets pregnant, and about 2 or 3 days before she's due to give birth, she starts making that nest. So she goes around, tries to find a nice suitable place, makes that nest, and it might be that the following nest that she has might be as close as about 30 centimeters away from that first nest if it's been a good site to bring up her young, or she might then move it, could be anything up to about 10 meters away, and make another nest. So we can't say we found 40 nests, that's 40 mice. Unfortunately, we haven't got a means of actually working out how many mice are there. The only thing we can really do on that is if we actually started to capture them, mark them, and do mark release, which is quite difficult. So it's really just a case of the more nests you find, it is assumed you have a bigger population, but that might not be the case.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Another question from Emily. On the question of set survey distances, is that determined by the surveyor, or do you require it in sort of set denominations, 100 meters, 200 meters? Or is it more kind of more relaxed than that?
It's still at the moment, I would say, ideally, yes, it would be nice to have sort of 100 meters and say that's enough and you can finish. And I think in some of the earlier protocols we had, we were suggesting that. But from last year and partly on this year, it's a case if you're in the right habitat and you want to look for further, then look for further. As long as we know the distance that you're looking over, so we can work out survey effort, then that's quite all right. And it is this. It might be that you start and you find one within the first meter of your survey. You could stop it there because that's a positive site. Or you could decide, well, no, I will go another 80, 90 meters. And if I only find that one nest, then that's one nest, but it's still present. It could be that rather than doing a survey, you just happen to stop at the side of the road and you look sideways and hey presto, there's a nest there. Then we still want to have that individual nest without the effort. And it's just a case of I saw it on this day and it went from there. All the information is helpful to try and fill in that interactive map that you saw.
Absolutely. Another question from Tanya. If areas you want to do a survey were surveyed in previous years, is it likely that someone will do those areas again in this current season?
Ideally, you ought to be in contact with your regional harvest mouse coordinator, who will be able to say, this is where I'd like you to go. Now, you don't have to follow what they say, but if they say, well, I've decided that we need to look at 10% of ones we looked at previous years, then they'll direct you there. Or they might suggest to you, well, actually, you ought to go there. And again, even if you've never done this before, then if you contact your regional coordinator, they'll be able to help and actually suggest maybe go to this site first, because we know there are nests there from previous years, help you get your eye in so that when you go to a site that hasn't got harvest mice before, or you haven't been found there before, then you've got a better idea of what you're looking for. But as I say, it's better to go out in groups, just because it gives you that little bit of a challenge. It makes it more fun.
Absolutely. Actually, on that note, if anyone does want to know who their regional coordinator is, you can email the Mammal Society, and we'll be able to put you in touch with someone. Next question from Ian, and I'm assuming this is based on the interactive map, Derek.
Yeah.
Why so few in Norfolk?
That's a good question. At the moment, we've relied heavily on local mammal groups. There isn't a local mammal group for. Well, there is one for Norfolk, but they're not that active. There are a lot of previous records for Norfolk, but people haven't got involved in looking for them on this last 2 years. And that interactive map only shows for the last 2 years of looking.
Yeah, and so it's probably more of a case of non-detection rather than no presence.
It's a case of no one's been looking. So
Yeah,
therefore, rather than non-detection.
Undersurveyed, sorry. Excuse me. Next question from Stuart. Do you tend to find harvest mice in I'm assuming areas where dogs are frequently walked, or do they tend to be in more kind of undisturbed habitat?
It's probably undisturbed habitat, although areas where dogs walk won't be a problem, because if you think about that how close that vegetation's got to be, dogs tend to walk on shorter grasses rather than through those longer grasses. So therefore there's that. But having said that, if you're walking your dog along a path and just off the side of it, you've got a bit of bramble, load of tall grasses going through it, look in the bramble and tall grasses, and you may well come across a nest. They're just looking at that right combination that goes with it. So one of the surveys we've done recently over in Burton is in a large country park next to the river. Lots and lots of short grass, lots and lots of dogs. But as soon as you leave that section and go towards some of the areas that people, it's slightly damp, so you've got rushes coming through, you've got reeds coming through, you've got bramble and things like that, then hey presto, that's where the harvest mice are. And they are no more than about a metre from the path.
That's fantastic. So it's always worth a look then.
It's always worth
wherever you are. Yeah. That's great. A question from anonymous. What specifically do harvest mice do or bring to a habitat to benefit their surroundings from a sort of ecological point of view?
That's a very good question. And it's a very difficult answer to give. We have made assumptions that if there is a good ecosystem there, then the harvest mice will play a part in that. They do their food that they do is in the summer quite insect based, and therefore they are removing some of the pest species from some of the grasses and areas that go with it. Although, as you can see from this wonderful little question slide, it's sitting on wheat sheaves. We don't tend to find them in cereal crops quite so often these days, and there's a big debate on why that is, and whether or not they were ever classified as an agricultural pest or not, or was it more down to the fact that most people tend to see them or see activity from them in the autumn, rather than it being that the fact it's about a harvest. Pre to mechanization for planting, that's actually kept the stalks further apart, and we don't tend to find that many harvest mice in crops, and also the growing seasons change slightly, or the harvest season has changed slightly, which is partly why we don't have some of those easy records to go with it. So I think they are just part of the natural grassland of insects and seeds at a in the taller grasses. There is although we do find in some reed beds and some of the other reed canary grasses and things, you will find some mixture with wood mice going up into the stalk layer and even bank voles. It is more the exploitation area for harvest mice. And again, it falls in line with the other small mammals as being prey for birds of prey, and also for stoats, weasels, etc. Although it has to be said, calorifically, you'd be better off to eat a wood mouse than you are to eat a harvest mouse. So it's a lot of effort to catch one for not a lot of return.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. I think one more question, and again we're going back to the interactive map. Could you let us know why some of the squares had diagonal lines on them?
No, I need to go back. I need to have a look at the map again to work that one out. Let me just right. So that's the diagonal lines. I can see them there now at Market Drayton and other places. I'm not too certain, but let me just get a key.
Are they non-detections in both years or something like that?
They might be non-detection in both years. I haven't got a key as such on this one at the moment. But yes, they are on squares where we've looked, but we haven't found.
I think we can. We'll probably go. Let's go with that for the moment. What we can do is we'll have a little kind of dig around the old files and come back with an answer to that one. If there are any more questions, I'm afraid we'll have to move on for now. But if you do pop them in the Q&A here, we can copy and paste them on the website underneath the video when we upload the recording for this session. So yes, thank you very much, Derek. That was fantastic. I'm quite concerned now that I've probably walked right over harvest mouse nests and not noticed them, and I wish I was looking now. So just a couple more things to say from the Mammal Society. If you didn't know, next week is actually the National Mammal Week, taking place from the 9th to the 15th of October. And this year we're exploring mammal connections, looking at the vital bonds of mammals in our lives and landscapes. We've got lots of activities planned for next week, including owl pellet dissections, a wildlife art competition, and many free webinars that you can join in. The first one is a free webinar that explores the importance of our mammals, including their vital ecological roles, conservation challenges, and how they're connected to us as humans. We'll be joined by the Mammal Society Chair and ecologist, Dr. Stephanie Ray, a naturalist and wildlife illustrator, Guy Troughton, and broadcaster, author, and Mammal Society patron, Zeb Stones, for this webinar on mammal connections. The second one is exploring how important bats are to our local landscapes, sharing insights from the Bat Conservation Trust's Project Nightwatch. Project Nightwatch was piloted with the aim of bringing bats to new audiences while increasing urban bat records. So please join us for this free webinar, and we'll celebrate the power of diversity and community in efforts to protect and champion the UK's wildlife. And finally, there's the Take Only Photos webinar, which will discuss how wildlife photography has the power to inspire others to protect wildlife and make positive changes to the environment, but must be conducted ethically to avoid disturbance and harm. Danny Connor will join us as a speaker for this webinar alongside a wildlife photographer and author, Susan Young, as we explore their best practices. I'd like to just kind of recover the Mammal Mapper app. I noticed a few chat messages there which were saying that it was they weren't able to download it on the from the Google Play Store on Android. This is an issue we're aware of at the moment, and it is with the software team. So we're working on it, and we're going to try and get it back up and running as soon as possible. But again,
sorry, what would be useful on that is if people can tell us which phone they've got on which.
Absolutely, that's right. If you
Which
can give
model?
us screenshots and the phone model, that can really help. And of course, if you do go out on Harvest Mouse surveys, you don't necessarily have to use the app, although it is useful. You can, like Derek said, just write down what you find, and we can enter it into the database manually. So thank you once again for joining, and thank you, Derek, once again for a fantastic introduction to the National Harvest Mouse Survey. Keep an eye out, everyone, for events like this in the future, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks for coming.